Welcome to Film in 5D, the show about everything film with the 5D Mark II. I'm your host, Aaron Hammock, and this week I'm extremely excited to be showing you guys my brand new camera, the Sony A7S.
So are we filming A7S now?
No, this is Film in 5D, the show about everything film with the Sony A7S.
That doesn't make sense.
Of course it makes sense. Why wouldn't it make sense? Film in 5D, A7S, perfect match.
Yeah.
Fine. The show about everything DSLR and cheap filmmaking with whatever camera I'm using at the time. How about that?
Okay.
Sound good? Thank you. Okay, so this episode won't be about what the A7S has and what the 5D doesn't, because honestly that simply isn't fair. The 5D is now 7-year-old technology, and with technology increasing so rapidly on the indie scene for the past few years, you would expect the A7S to have a few next-gen features like 4K, wireless technology, etc. that the 5D wouldn't. Instead, I will be doing a separate episode really putting the A7S through its paces and showing you guys what this camera has to offer. For this episode, I'm going to go over some of the features that caught my eye for this camera that made this a surefire upgrade over my 5D. Now, since I got my 5D over 3 years ago, as you guys know, I've been sitting on my hands watching all the new cameras come out, like the 5D Mark II and all these brand new cameras, waiting for the one that was truly an upgrade for me. So I was actually watching Dave Dugdale's review on the GH4, and it kind of inspired me to sell off all my Canon stuff, my Canon lenses, my accessories, everything that I had for my 5D, and just upgrade to the A7S, which I'm in the process of doing right now. He basically said that he thought that Canon wasn't really doing a great job for the video market. Like, yeah, you have the C100 and the C300, but C300 is a $20,000 camera and the C100 is a $6,000 video camera. And that's really not within my budget. I mean, I have to buy lights, I have to buy audio equipment, I have to buy all this other stuff. I can't be spending $6,000 on a camera. So for $2,500 for the body, I can invest that extra $3,000 in lenses and stuff. And I thought that was such a great idea. And I really like what Sony's doing. I like what Panasonic's doing also, but I really wanted to stick with the full frame sensor, and we'll talk about that right now. Now, it's fair to say that I've gotten lots of good use out of my Canon over the past 3 years. But to be honest, there were definitely some shortcomings that I just couldn't handle anymore. The first and most important difference between the two is the sensor. The 5D has a 21 megapixel sensor, while the Sony has a 12 megapixel sensor. Both are full frame, but the main difference being how the A7S sensor works with video. When the 5D first came out back in 2008, it really wasn't intended to be used as a video camera. It was designed for photojournalists to take high quality stills and occasionally a video to document their work. But after a couple of firmware releases and a demonstration by Vincent Laforet, the 5D became the spark of the DSLR revolution. But unfortunately for us Canon fanboys, that's where it stopped. And now obviously they came out with the 5D Mark III, the 7D shortly after the 5D Mark II, the Rebel line with the T2i, T3i, and T4i, the entry-level filmmaker DSLRs, and even the 6D, which for all intents and purposes was designed for video. But at the end of the day, these were all still photo cameras that could take video if you wanted to. This is in contrast to camera manufacturers like Sony and Panasonic that, while they were late to the party, have pushed forward the DSLR revolution into the future, even with 4K. It just really annoys me that the marketing / research / whatever team over at Canon is not listening to users and is instead coming out with video cameras that are quite frankly just out of our price range. Don't get me wrong, the C300 and the C100, they look like awesome studio cameras. But for the price and not even having 4K, I just don't know how you could justify that. But back to the topic at hand. The sensors of the 5D and the A7S are actually both full frame. But one of them was designed with video in mind, and the other was designed to take amazing pictures and then downres them to HD resolution for video, which obviously resulted in line skipping, pixel binning, giving you aliasing, moire, and all that nasty stuff. To illustrate this, let's look at a full HD 1080p frame, which contains about 2 million pixels. And here is what a 4K Ultra HD frame looks like next to it, which contains about 8 to 9 million pixels for reference. So for the 5D, which is 21 megapixels, in order to record video, it would have to downres by more than 10 times, which it does by line skipping, pixel binning, etc. Now compare this to the A7S, which doesn't have to downres at all, and is using its sensor that reproduces pixel for pixel. Now for anyone who owns a 5D, you know that the photos look amazing. They're tack sharp if you have quality glass, they have great color reproduction, maybe a tad bit saturated in the reds, and most importantly, they're very detailed. But somehow, all of this is lost in translation to video. And I don't know if this is a processor thing or if it has to do with the down-resing mentioned before. I honestly have no idea. All I know is I don't like it. So this brings me to the first upgrade the A7S has over the 5D for me, the detail. The detail on this camera is amazing. No longer am I getting soft, out of focus, wide shots that just look flat and boring. Everything is in clear detail and looks beautiful. And keep in mind, both of these cameras are full frame and thus have the shallow depth of field essentially built in, which is awesome for close-ups, don't get me wrong, but with the wide shots you really want as much detail as possible. My second worthwhile upgrade is the low light performance. Now this camera is being touted as the low light king, which is everything an indie filmmaker needs. This is a feature for those of us who can't always shoot at ISO 100 and have enough wattage of light to make a scene look normal. Now, the reason there is such a tremendous difference in low light sensitivity between these two cameras is the layout of the sensor. And this is true for the 5D Mark III as well. While that camera definitely performs better in low light because of the new Digic 5 processor, the sensors are virtually the same. The Sony A7S though has the exact same size sensor, but fewer pixels, almost half as many pixels in fact. For photos, this is not necessarily a good thing, but for video, this means that the pixels on the sensor are twice as big, and thus are able to collect more light. This also means that, like I mentioned before, the A7S does not have to do any down-resing, pixel binning, line skipping. In fact, all it really has to do is take this 36 by 24mm frame or a 6x4 picture image and cut off the top and bottom and turn it into a 16:9 aspect ratio, which is what you get with HD movies. In other words, what you see is what you get. The A7S might be the most sensitive low-light camera on the market currently, and if it's not, it's definitely the best low-light performer in this price range. I was getting solid low-light shots upwards of 40K ISO. Actually, I was pretty much noticing the same noise at 800 ISO that I was seeing at 12,500 ISO at times. And that's great. But what does that really mean for us as independent filmmakers? I mean, sure, it means that you can shoot in available light and sometimes even no light at all if you wanted to. And that's awesome. But for me, what this really means is that instead of shooting stopped all the way down to f1.4 like I was on the 5D, in many situations, I can actually shoot at f5.6 and then just boost the ISO to a reasonable amount to get a properly exposed shot that isn't hard to focus with. Here's an example of a short we did for a Halloween episode a few years back, where I was using the 50mm stopped all the way down to f1.4. Notice how I'm constantly fighting to keep the moving subject and camera in focus. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that I won't ever be using shallow depth of field anymore. In fact, that's one of the reasons I fought so hard to stay with the full frame camera, because that's what they're really good at, that shallow depth of field. All I'm saying is that now I have more creative options. In this shot from a past sketch, I didn't really want a shallow depth of field. I just wanted a properly exposed image that I could keep in focus. But unfortunately, I was forced to stop all the way down to f1.8 so that I could keep everything properly exposed. Things like frame rate, shutter speed, aperture, these are all creative options that we have, and changing them can dramatically change not only the look of our work, but the feel of our work as well. Therefore, being able to use high ISOs opens up way more options for me to either stop up my aperture, lengthening my depth of field, or maybe even increasing shutter speed for a more fast-paced action scene. These are all creatively driven options that a camera like this can just free you up for. And now for my third and final reason I saw this as a great upgrade, and maybe it's the most obvious, 4K. To be honest, I don't even own a 4K monitor yet, as probably most of you. But for me, the prospect of 4K has been in my mind for over 2 years now. I've just been waiting for a 4K camera that is actually in my price range. As I illustrated before, a 4K image is 4 times the size of a full HD 1080p image. That's over 6 million more pixels. But let's just say, for instance, that you're working in broadcast for a client who only needs a full HD end product. 4K can still help you out tremendously, because essentially you get 4 to 6 1080p full HD frames out of just one 4K Ultra HD frame. In other words, it's like having 2 to 3 cameras. For example, let's say you're doing a 2-person interview, but you only have one camera. Well, if you're shooting in 4K, that means you can have your 2 shot, and then you can cut into a close-up of subject 1, and then cut to another close-up of subject 2, and that basically gives you 3 separate frames, all at the same resolution. You can actually do even more than just punch-ins. You can do digital zooms or pans in 4K, and then you just down-res them to 1080p, which just gives you so many creative options. But unfortunately, this camera uses an external recorder to record 4K, which isn't a bad thing, it's just not out yet. But I will be doing an episode on 4K when it becomes available for the A7S later this year. One last note on my upgrade to the A7S. When the 5D Mark III first came out, I made an episode about it. I was telling you guys why I would not be upgrading. And one of the reasons was that it just didn't have 60 frames per second in full HD. Well, this camera does have that. It also has 120 frames per second at 720p for super slow motion. But I'll cover that and more features this camera has to offer in my review of the A7S in my next episode. If you guys have any questions or comments, please leave them below, or you can send them via @mentions to our Twitter page at Filmin5D or on Facebook at this link here. We'll be back next time with a full review on the A7S as well as my next short film.
So, what's gonna happen to the old 5D?
Don't say anything, but I'm gonna sell it on eBay along with all the lenses. And these lenses are actually pretty sick. I don't know if you saw them. The Zeiss lenses, like this thing's probably sharper than my 50 1.4. It's the 55 1.8, but this thing's pretty nice. And I kind of just want to go with the E-mount lenses, you know, upgrade. Just leave the 5D behind. I mean, it's a good camera, but that thing is huge, dude. This thing, I didn't even talk about this. This thing is small. I mean, it's like just like more powerful and smaller. Like, why would I keep that old? Why would I keep that old thing?
You know, it's standing right there.
Wow, I love you, A7S. You're my favorite camera ever.